people want deer back to 1950 levels, moose back to 1980 levels. But right now, the bear population is at unprecedented highs, and it generates a lot of revenue in terms of out-of-state guiding opportunity. So now people want bears at current levels. Well,
yeah,
you know,
we want everything. Want their cake and have it too. Yeah.
Well, we want everything that we, our fathers or our grandfathers or grandmothers can ever remember.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Christoph. On this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode was a fun one. I'm talking with Dan Harrison, and he was actually on last episode. Last episode, we talked with Bob Wagner, Milo Mihalovic, and Dan Harrison about valuing forests. How do we balance public perception with the scientific realities, right? So it was a really good conversation, and I wanted to continue that conversation into today. You don't need to listen to last week's episode or 3 weeks ago episode to understand today, but it is a good precursor and gets you into the conversation. So that was also an incredible conversation. But today's conversation, we're going to focus specifically on wildlife relationships with the forest. And so to talk about the relationship between wildlife and the forest, we brought on, like I said, Dan Harrison. He's a professor of wildlife and forest ecology at the University of Maine. And for the last 30 years, he's been working between wildlife biology and forest management to try and suss out these solutions to make sure that everybody wins, right? So today we wanted to focus on that, on the big picture of how do we make sure that we manage forests for all values. And today we're going to focus on wildlife values. So biodiversity, wildlife health, that kind of stuff, and just talking about the relationship between forest management and wildlife management. So how do we combine those two so that we're aiming for the same thing and getting the same result at the end, right? For a lot of years in the past, there was a lot of parallel processes going on, a lot of wasted energy, and maybe not a lot of collaboration. So we know now that collaboration is important, and we want to talk about how do we do that, right? So coarse filter approaches and making things relatable so that, we can make these decisions on a landscape level, right? So it was an awesome conversation. You guys are really going to like it. Sponsors for this week. Wes Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2020, and I could not thank them enough for their support. It has allowed this podcast to be possible, so thank you so much, Wes Fraser. I really appreciate it. Also, Greenlink Forestry is a sponsor, and they have been with me since the beginning, and again, could not do this without them. Thank you so much. And finally, Damaged Timber is a company out of Edmonton, Alberta, and they are selling damaged timber, although they do some stuff to it, though, before they sell it. So they go out into the bush, into wildfire burnt areas, cut down some trees, bring it back to the shop, turn it into something cool you can put in your kitchen, like cutting boards, butcher blocks, charcuterie boards, that kind of stuff. Super, super cool. Check them out, damagedtimber.com. Put in Your Forest 10 at checkout, and you can get 10% off. Also, they donate 10% of all their sales go towards a environmental sciences scholarship. So you're supporting environmental science through buying cool stuff, which is awesome. So check them out. And without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation with Dan talking about the relationship between forest management and wildlife management. Here we go.
One of the disconnects for foresters trying to work with wildlife biologists is the ambiguousness and the vastness of the concept of maintaining biodiversity. When you look at Maine forests, for example, we're dealing with over 480 vertebrate species alone, not to speak of the plants and the fungi and the insects and everything else. So if folks are talking about forestry that's sensitive to maintaining biodiversity, that can be overwhelming when wildlifers start coming to the door of the forester with prescriptions for species-specific prescriptions of management for species of concern, maybe declining species, federally or state or provincially listed threatened or endangered species. And then the public speaks out and says, no, there's some species we like that we recreate with, and we would like more deer or more elk or more moose or more caribou. And pretty soon the forester is getting pulled in so many directions that oftentimes I see them starting to tune out. And as wildlifers, I think we need to simplify what we're asking for, and then avoid being too prescriptive about it, because we've looked at responses of quite an array of taxa of wildlife to forest management. We call them forest management treatments that might be shelterwood harvesting or partial harvesting or clear cuts with and without herbiciding, with and without pre-commercial thinning. And we find that for the most part, animals don't make judgments based on forest treatments. They make judgments based on forest structure. They don't ask trees how old they are, what species they are. They're not prejudiced.
Yeah, for sure.
There are certain structural and physical characteristics of the forest, and sometimes compositional characteristics of the forest that they need. And I think foresters are much more comfortable with being told, this is a suite of forest structural characteristics that would benefit wildlife that we think are important or that might be lacking in the forests that you're managing in New Brunswick or Western Canada, etc. And to leave it up to the forester to create those conditions, because foresters feel like, well, if you tell us what you want, we can design a silvicultural and harvesting approach that will get us there. So, foresters like the idea and are much more comfortable with outcome-based forestry type approaches, where in fact, I think where the rubber meets the road is, okay, how effective are outcome-based forestry approaches, and can they be implemented over large enough scales to actually benefit the species that we want to benefit? And so it comes from two sides. It comes from foresters being able to demonstrate that they can provide the wildlife habitat that society is asking for without regulatory prescriptive type approaches, imposed on them. And wildlifers, on the other hand, refining and packaging their requests in a way that aren't contradictory and asking for more early successional species for Canada lynx on the same land that they're asking for late successional conifer forest for American martins and white-tailed deer. And so I think those are the challenges on both sides of the coin.
Right. So gotta dumb it down for us foresters, and I'm just kidding. But yeah, no, I totally see what you're saying though. Like, I liked something that Bob said near the middle of the episode we all did together, was something about how societies we've kind of pushed nature out of everywhere else except for forest. So like all of our ideals and ideas about wilderness and nature has all been pushed to the forest, and that almost by accident almost by accident foresters have become the curators of that forest. And we obviously we don't have all of that. Like, we know how to grow back trees and how to, try to think about the grand ecological scale of things. But as far as the specifics around, individual species and protecting water quality and everything else that we have to think about, then we need the information from other disciplines, right? So when it comes to that, like, getting these things to actual work, getting the communication to work, and getting effective management on both sides, to date, how well do you think we're doing with obviously in a big scale, how well do you think we're doing communicating and trying to balance out these values so we can come up with some kind of grand scheme solution to ensure sustainability for everything?
Well, I think how we're doing varies greatly depending on who owns the land and what are the dynamics in the land ownership pattern. So in Canada, where you have large areas of crown forest, and in the U.S., where we have large areas in the western U.S. of U.S. national forest, I think we do very well in a lot of places because we can think about the landscape requirements and of wildlife over multiple stands, and we can also think about what might be limiting in a particular landscape. For example, if it was a landscape that was historically old growth forest and now it's primarily young forest, then maintaining some old forest structure in some areas might be kind of a unifying goal of foresters and wildlife managers, and might promote biodiversity and species at risk. Where it gets more difficult is in places like I work here in Maine, where we have primarily privately owned forests. And, of course, in Eastern Canada, it's more of a mosaic of privately owned and crown lands. And in that case, what we've seen is sustainability was built in because of economic investments by landowners who had hundreds of millions of dollars invested in mills and all kinds of social capital in local communities and training of folks and culture, and support for what they were doing. And now, as we see, for example, pulp market shifting, paper demand declining, you see our forests being used for different reasons and being owned for different reasons. And those large ownerships are breaking up, and oftentimes they're owned by timber investment interests who have investment windows that may be 10 to 15 years. And I think that's a huge challenge for us, both in terms of spatial scale and temporal scale. And that,
no kidding.
How do you manage for wildlife habitat and sustainability of biodiversity and forest sustainability on a 15-year investment window?
Yeah, no kidding, right? It's like one generation of bears.
and so that's become a huge reality for us here. And as land ownerships get smaller, most foresters are trained to harvest and in a way and apply silviculture in a way to promote desirable stand level conditions. But most of the wildlife that are having problems because they need conditions over many, many, many stands. And so trying to think about how your stands fit together in the landscape context is very complex and difficult to do. I mean, even if you're on a huge piece of crown land or national forest land, and becomes really, really tough when you're trying to conserve a wide-ranging, federally threatened species like Canada lynx on private ownerships, where the lynx habitat spans across lots of boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think, so as far as so like you said, foresters, we cut down a stand and we want to bring back that same stand. That's kind of the simple part of it, right? If we cut down a white spruce stand, we want a white spruce stand back. If we cut down an aspen stand, we want an aspen stand back. That's pretty much how we try to do it on the public land scale, right? And I guess what we need to go into is that enough for a wildlife is that enough to maintain that, you know what I mean, that variety and that broad scale, landscape scale, variety. So to allow wildlife populations to exist and be healthy and thrive, right? So I guess before we dive real deep into this, can we talk a little bit about how we measure wildlife management? How do we measure success when it comes to wildlife populations? Like, what are the things we're thinking about? Like, obviously biodiversity. So the number of different types of creatures on the landscape is obviously a big one, but what else are we worried about? What are we trying to measure?
Right. And certainly we want to maintain biodiversity, and the way we've done that is either through coarse filter approaches where we say, okay, early successional species need this suite of characteristics, and we're going to manage part of the landscape for early successional structure and function. And we have species that need older forests or a forest of a particular composition, and we're going to maintain some areas that maintain that and bring those along. But then we've also got species of concern, species that have declined for whatever reason. It could be something outside of the local area, or it could be declining, in our case, declining composition or configuration or increasing fragmentation of mature conifer forest. And so many of our species of concern in our forests fall into that category. So now you're into more fine filter approach. You're saying, okay, we need to do some even age management followed by herbicide, which may be very unnatural, to try and accelerate the regeneration of conifer forest for conifer-associated birds that are declining in our region, and for which we happen to be really important from a national biodiversity standpoint. So all of a sudden, you got these coarse filter approaches that work, but then you have this group of species that is falling through the cracks for whatever reason, and they need species-specific management approaches. And so one of the challenges is addressing those individual needs of the species that are likely to fall through the cracks while doing the kind of general things that keep most of the other species happy.
Gotcha. That totally makes sense. So you think that on the broad scale, like we discussed last time, you were talking about using these umbrella species, right? Like the Canada lynx and marten, as if you can maintain Canada lynx habitat and marten habitat, that you're going to maintain 80% of the biodiversity or the wildlife health, I guess, on the landscape. Exactly. So then now, okay, perfect. So now, so you think we're doing a pretty good job of that? Is that what I'm hearing? And that now,
yeah, I think we're starting to do a better job of that. Where we can manage for larger landscapes, we do a pretty good job of that. Here in Maine, for example, we were doing a fine job for lynx and marten early in the clear-cut era, but then when forest regulations jumped in and forced us to manage in ways that weren't conducive to early successional or late successional wildlife biodiversity, we started to see more problems. And biodiversity is not in as good a shape as it was during from my perspective, during the period of extensive clear cutting following a big spruce budworm outbreak in the 70s and 80s. That's what led to forest regulation, but the forest regulation really is driven by, and oftentimes this is where I think the public gets conflicted, is that they think forests that don't look disturbed and from their perspective and have remaining standing trees are healthy. And early successional forests following something like clear cutting are not healthy. And therefore, what they push for is, because the forest is going to be harvested one way or the other, because there's fiber needs, or if they're private lands, that's the reason for owning the land, or the primary reason. So what happens is you get a lot of management in the middle, and I think that's a real risk right now in forest management, as we manage to what makes the public feel comfortable, which is not a natural condition. It's an aesthetically acceptable condition, but it's not promoting large blocks of mature conifer-dominated forest, for example, in our region for martens, and it's not supporting large areas of early successional forest for snowshoe hares and Canada lynx and all the forest birds associated with that kind of habitat. So you end up with a lot of common species in the middle, and a lot of species falling through the cracks on either edge.
Yeah. Oh, no kidding, for sure. Well, yeah, that is a big issue, right? The idea of, people go into the forest and, you know what I mean, their perception of what is natural. And young forests seem to be, they're not as aesthetically pleasing, not as spiritually connected somehow, right? People love those big old trees, and they're like, this is an ancient thing, and I'm connected to nature and to the earth and all this kind of stuff. And then we lose that perception of the connection when it comes to, something that's been recently disturbed and that kind of thing. So I totally understand what you're saying. Yeah.
And all the controversy related to, or not all of it, but the vast majority of the controversy and the media articles and the complaints and op-eds, et cetera, it went away when forest companies said, hey, we've had 3 referendums to ban clear cutting. We've got a Forest Practices Act that puts a disincentive on large clear cuts. We're not going to clear cut hardly at all. And we're going to just go to this partial harvesting where we take, half the wood out over twice the area to meet our fiber objectives. And then you amateurize that over 30 years. And here in the state of Maine, we've got about 10 million acres of additional partially harvested areas that fall in that middle ground that aren't habitat for the species that want mid and late successional forests and sizable blocks, and isn't there for the early successional species. And yet the controversy's gone away, because even though these stands are after harvesting are stuck below the standard that most forest wildlife would call, intact forest, and they might get very, very little use by those species. When you drive by them, you don't have the guttural response to, wow, that's been cut and devastated, and isn't all that ground ugly. And so I think the public thinks they want biodiversity. They definitely want aesthetics, and they also want wildlife species at all their favorite species at the highest levels they could ever remember them.
We want whitetails and grizzly bears and caribou and all this stuff. The wolves.
Yeah. Maine has a public planning process, right? So, I mean, the wolf had been extirpated there. The eastern coyote hadn't colonized northern Maine. There was lots of deer wintering habitat, old conifer forest in northern Maine. So in the 1950s and 60s, deer, which were always very rare in northern Maine, exploded. And a big guiding and sporting tradition built up over several decades. And so now the state of Maine has spent a huge amount of time, now that the eastern coyote is here and the deer wintering areas have largely been fragmented and cut out, and the deer population is a small fraction of what it was. And we've been swimming upstream trying to recreate an anomaly, basically a 20-year anomaly in the last 10,000 years. And so a lot of the management and a lot of the policy in Maine has been motivated by that. And then after we cut out the deer wintering areas, it created a lot of habitat for moose, and we had the highest moose populations that anyone could ever remember. Right. And so now the public wants as many moose as there were in the 1980s and 1990s when the clear-cuts were all growing back.
Yeah.
But they passed the Forest Practices Act, which didn't allow those to occur to that extent anymore. So now the moose population is declining. And so people want deer back to 1950 levels, moose back to 1980 levels. But right now, the bear population is at unprecedented highs, and it generates a lot of revenue in terms of out-of-state guiding opportunity in a lot of rural areas that can really use the money. So now people want bears at current levels. Well,
yeah. We want everything. We want their cake and have it too. Yeah.
Well, we want everything that we, our fathers or our grandfathers or grandmothers can ever remember.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And we spend a lot of time, I think, policy-wise, trying to chase those public objectives. And at the same time, the public is saying, don't let it, another cohort of the public is saying, well, don't let anything go extinct, which I think is I share that view. I'm also a hunter, but I don't share the views that we should have deer numbers at the 1950s levels. And so it's a quandary, and you can see both wildlife biologists get frustrated because they're being asked to do a bunch of different things and recommend different things to foresters, and the foresters are frustrated because the competing goals can't be achieved on the same piece of land.
Yeah, no kidding. It's funny how we do that as people. Hey, like I'm a hunter as well, and I remember like having conversations with my dad, my uncle, and stuff like that about like, oh yeah, back when I was hunting, it was like this, and there was this many moose and this many deer, and it's not the same now. Like the wildlife management around here is garbage. And then you know what I mean? Like you hear about stories like, when settlers first came to North America and talking about, the millions of head of bison that would be on the prairies and that kind of thing. And there's argument about whether or not that was natural, or if that was just you know what I mean? If that was the natural stasis, that there was always that many, or if that was just a peak in the population numbers that they were trying to chase after that forever, right? So it's funny how we figured out something that we like, and we're like, yeah, let's get that, and then but we don't have the foresight to balance out how many of those things are actually accomplishable on the same landscape.
Yep.
So
I think group objective setting among foresters and wildlifers, and there's a lot more of that going on, is the way out of this mess, because the foresters and the wildlifers, at the end of the day, they both want a healthy forest. I've never experienced animosity or disconnect in 35 years of consecutive work with Maine's forest industry. In fact, they've been some of the strongest supporters, and in many cases, more willing than the agencies to accept bad news results from research.
Oh, yeah.
Because
that's cool.
Research is always somewhat risky, whether you're looking at a COVID vaccine or a forest issue, because if you're truly objective, you don't know what the outcome's going to be. And that's why you're doing the research, and you've got to have trust, and people have to put their agendas, leave them at the door. And then we've got to adaptively respond to what the science tells us. And I've been really lucky in Maine that commercial forest industry has been willing to accept good and bad results. And they've had some really good results, because lynx were supposed to be an old growth conifer dependent species, because that's where there's snowshoe hares in some areas of the West. But in our largest population of lynx in Maine, it was in regenerating clearcuts, and foresters were the friend of the lynx, and that was a good news story for them. But the fragmentation of forests relative to American marten is not necessarily a good news story. But there's enough trust, and they're happy to listen to that and work forward. I haven't seen that same kind of openness, unfortunately, from some of the agencies, which know which direction they want to go with management, and they want results that are going to suggest a particular preconceived direction. And I, as a researcher, I have more trouble with that than I have working directly with forest managers, because, again, everybody wants a healthy forest.
Yeah. I suppose that's a politics thing, hey, on the agency side, I imagine. But yeah.
Well, I mean, one just needs to look at the dynamics of either Canadian or U.S. Policy over time, and we know that policy shifts with administrations, right?
For sure, yeah.
And the receptiveness and whether you're looking for purely economic outcomes or holistic success is goes back and forth, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
And of course, we talked about those divergent public views and who wants what. So if you've got a group that wants to delist the lynx as their sole objective and wants to make more deer for northern Maine, and they grab onto those particular constituencies, that can frustrate wildlife ecologists and foresters uniformly, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah. The public advocacy groups can be challenging at times when they become zealots of their cause and not really objective in the grand scheme of things. Yeah. That's definitely an issue we have in forestry for sure. But yeah, there's something you said there that I thought was really interesting and is important to point out again, I think, and highlight is like you said, when we engage in research and we're not sure of the outcome, when an outcome does come out that is, unfavorable to an industry or whatever it is, we can't go looking for a different answer. Like if we know that that's what it is, we have to be willing to shift our model with that new knowledge, and we can't be, going online and trying to find some explanation as to why it's bogus or whatever. So I like that you said that it's been successful in adapting to both positive and negative research, and to truly trying to find that sustainable pocket where we can exist, right? So that's awesome. That's really good to hear. When it comes to on a grand scheme of things, like you said, we're doing pretty good at managing the big picture thing. So at this point, it sounds like we need to, now that we have a hold on that for the most part, especially on public land, how do we start to dial in these species that are falling through the cracks? Because like if like you said, if managing these umbrella species like marten and lynx gets us 80% of the way there, the other 20%, if that disappears off the landscape, we're going to be pretty pissed. So obviously there's going to be a lot of advocacy groups about that, and a lot of public concern. And I know there are specific policies in certain provinces and states about managing for some of these specific species at risk and concern. But when we start to approach this thing, I imagine we come across the same problems as before, as like each species of concern is going to have a vastly different need on the landscape. And so how do we start to tackle that last 20%? How do we fine tune forest management to include those other species as well?
Well, so I guess the approach that we've taken in our lab, I'm not saying it's the approach to take, but
sure,
it's an approach, is to try and let the landscape speak to us and tell us where are the big shifts occurring from the landscape that may be, I'm not sure that we need to be chasing a natural landscape because we're expecting products from forests. But we should be looking not to lose components of our landscape. And so when we look at the landscapes of Maine, we see what we're losing is mature conifer forest has declined about 40%, and the average number of patches the number of patches in the northern Maine landscape has increased 8-fold. The average size of the patches has declined. There's much more edge associated with our patches. And lo and behold, a lot of our species that are declining are species that are specific to conifer forests. And so we know that partial harvesting is shifting forests towards a more hardwood component after harvesting. And we know that the amount of conifer forest is declining. The patches are getting smaller. So we go out and focus our research on species that are showing declining trends that use conifer forest and find out what are the particular things that they're looking for in conifer forest, and are there ways in management that we can try to mitigate some of that?
Yeah.
And so, for example, a bunch of the forest associated birds that we've looked at that like mid and late successional conifer forests, which isn't out there in great numbers, do really well in clear-cut areas that are herbicide and then pre-commercially thinned because they come back to conifers and they grow fast. So they develop mature forest characteristics. Of course, the challenge working with foresters is that's a big investment that you're amortizing through time. So how do you make sure that habitat stays on the ground long enough to benefit the species in question? So that's a discussion in a forest planning process, but we've learned how to do it. And we found that some species like the spruce grouse, which is regionally at risk, very common in the boreal forests of Canada, but regionally at risk, is declining virtually everywhere. Everyone studies it in these transitional forest landscapes. And so we're either going to need some, over the long term, some rescue ideas, or we're going to have to change our objectives and try to just maintain populations in places like large parks and reserves, and alter our goal of having spruce grouse everywhere and just try to keep them represented, in the landscape. So there's a lot of push and shove, but we can't meet everybody's objectives on every piece of ground at any given time.
No. Well, that's interesting that you say that you guys have had such trouble because of public involvement, and I'm sure all kinds of other factors as well, of just maintaining that broad cover group on the landscape. Like that sounds like the issue that you guys are having, like maintaining just that broad cover group that you're supposed to have and that broad age group of trees too, right? That's interesting that that's become an issue. Do you think that was just because of the last 50 years there where you were talking about the public involvement created these weird incentives, or was it something before that where maybe there was just we overdid the logging early on and got rid of a lot of those old growth forests and never really caught up again?
Well, old growth is really here not an issue because it's less than 1% of the functional landscape. So,
okay, gotcha.
But we also have very, very few species here that, in fact, they're non-vascular plants that have been connected specifically to old growth. We don't have a spotted owl here, but we do we did have expansive areas of conifer dominated and mixed, mature and mid to late successional forest. And when I say late successional forest, I'm talking 100 years old, not 300 years old.
Yeah, right. Excuse me. And that's on the decline.
And those were the areas that that got hit with the spruce budworm outbreak. Those were the areas where we had salvage operations. That's during that whole time, in the 70s and 80s, the paper markets were so strong. We saw great expansion and investment in our paper mills. And so that's where the harvesting pressure was. But then when the public decided that they didn't like big rolling clear cuts, and don't forget, big rolling clear cuts also allowed us to keep big areas of mid-successional forest on the landscape. But when they decided they didn't like that and passed a Forest Practices Act that put disincentive on large clear cuts, the landowners responded in the first 2 years by making small clear cuts. That's what the law forced them to do. And so the small clear cuts started to fragmented the remaining patches of forest at a much higher rate. Yeah. People saw that and said, no, clear cutting in general is bad. And we had 3 public referendums to ban clear cutting. Yeah. And so at that point, everything shifted over to partial harvesting. And partial harvesting, the conifer trees are more valuable in general. And so the conifer trees are disproportionately harvested. And the light that comes in after partial harvesting favors shade intolerant hardwoods that colonize the stands faster. So we're seeing this big shift to deciduous dominant forests and losing our conifer forests. And it's be careful what you ask for. And the public asked for less clear cuts, but now what we're losing are sizable blocks of conifer forests that, Maine supports, for example, 96% of the habitat for the bay-breasted warbler, which is a species of in decline, a priority bird species of our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Well, Maine had 96% of the habitat. It's in spruce fir forests. It's declining.
That's hard, man. That's hard. So just maintaining that broad cover group is crucially important. You guys had kind of the perfect storm there, like you said, with the spruce budworm. It's similar to the BC story, right? Where just the perfect storm of pine beetle took out most of the, like a lot of the pine, and then fires after that. And then so now they're having all kinds of issues with sustainability from a number of different fronts because of this unprecedented problem. So I don't think, your guys' situation it's not, you're not alone in that for sure, but it's, So how do you guys see yourselves getting out of this problem? Like, how do you see yourselves? Do you foresee a future where you can get these mid to late successional conifer forests or conifer components back on the land base, or do you think it's something that's just not going to be feasible? Because obviously there is a long timeline to get that, right? You plant a spruce tree now, it's going to take 80 years before you get where you want it to be. So.
Yeah. And of course here we don't, or historically didn't plant much at all. In fact, our natural regeneration comes in, so dense that we need to oftentimes thin, to promote growth. But we are not alone because the Acadian forest, and the Atlantic northern forest, either one, spreads across northern Vermont, northern New Hampshire, Maine, a lot of southern Quebec, touches into eastern Ontario, covers all of New Brunswick, all of Nova Scotia, PEI. And so this is a huge region, and in fact, the largest contiguous forest block in eastern North America. And so these issues that I talk about in Maine really apply across the region. And I think there's a real challenge to maintaining particularly the mid and late successional conifer associated species. And, when we had our spruce budworm outbreak and paper was the product of the region, what happened is, after clear cutting, balsam fir, which is a very short-lived species, outcompeted spruce in those stands. And when they went in and pre-commercially thinned, because fir grows back faster than spruce, they didn't select for spruce over fir.
Oh no.
So now the paper market has drastically collapsed, and so the demand for softwood pulp has declined, and we have these regenerated forests that are dominated by balsam fir, which are very susceptible to the next budworm outbreak, which has already started in Quebec. And we don't have the spruce composition. Even though it's called spruce budworm, of course, it disproportionately affects fir, actually. And so we don't have the fir or the spruce in the stands to buffer the fir mortality. And so the challenge to maintain these stands through time is going to be difficult, because fir stands pretty much fall apart by the time they're 80 years old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is, man, we really know how to screw shit up when we put our minds to it. Well, we're trying to do the right thing. I understand that, but it's like, it's funny the power that we have as human beings. And you said something earlier about, thinking that at least in where you guys are in Maine, that you're kind of past choosing natural forests. You've kind of blown right past that. And now you're into the stage of trying to balance out all these values in some way that they can all coexist and keep people happy. Right. So that's a crazy situation you guys found yourself in.
Yeah. Wow. And I think Eastern Canada is in that situation as well, just because you manage to markets, but trees take a long time to grow and markets change fast.
Absolutely.
So yeah. Our university here sits on the Penobscot River, which is the largest river system in Maine. And we lost the mills in the towns of Millinocket and East Millinocket. And then going down the river, we lost the mill in Lincoln. And then we lost the mill in Howland Enfield, and the mill in Old Town, the mill in Brewer, and the mill where the river hits the ocean in Bucksport. And that's just on one river in each one of those supported towns. And there were tens of thousands of acres of land being harvested to support every one of those mills. And those lands were being managed for pulpwood production. And now the pulpwood market has pretty much disappeared.
Wow. That's terrible. Well, I guess, yeah, I don't even know how to respond to that. It's almost like you guys you're still trying to sort out the coarse filter approach, not even at the fine filter spot yet, really.
Well, my point being is, there's a lot of moving parts here. We've got biodiversity, which I think should rank up number one along with forest sustainability, coupled with shifting human priorities and demands. And then you've got regulations, ownership patterns, and markets.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot to balance. It's insane. We're so fortunate up in the Boreal in Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, all that, to have so much intact, quote unquote natural forest, just because of the latitude, right? Pretty much nobody wants to go up there. So I can't imagine the increased complexity of trying to do so where there are a lot of people, right? Like and everyone's got a strong opinion about what things should be like. So that's bananas.
Yeah, the people don't so much live and work in the forest anymore. The populations of people, I mean, Maine only has 1 million people, and most of them live outside of the commercial forest lands in southern Maine. So they travel to the forests to recreate, hunt, fish, wildlife watch, moose watch, canoe, etc. And they have expectations of the forest when they arrive there. But actually in the forest, it's an unbroken matrix. I mean, if you get in a plane or in a vehicle and drive to my lynx study area from the university, you drive for 4.5 hours and you pass one resident.
Yeah. We all got our different problems.
There's no people living in the woods. It's not that pressure. It's, there's 150 million people within a day's drive of northern Maine, that like to come here seasonally and recreate, and they have expectations.
Dude, we don't even have a quarter of that in our whole entire country. So
right.
150 million is a lot.
I think these same pressures we're feeling. I work a lot with folks from New Brunswick, and some with folks from Quebec, and a lot of these same pressures are affecting them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I want to talk a little bit about some of the specifics about like forest harvest and that kind of stuff, and little things that you think might help biodiversity or might help wildlife habitat and that kind of stuff. So when it comes to like something that we do a lot in Alberta is residual patches. So when we do a cut block, and we still do big cut blocks that are they follow the landscape, and we take stand types, right? So they're not squares, they're not they just follow the stand type. So you remove whole sections of stands at a time, and we leave patches within that depending on what we're focusing on of live and living trees, and sometimes even corridors through them. And there's like all kinds of other stuff that we do. Like sometimes we leave standing dead trees for birds and that kind of thing. And so like how much of this fine tuning of wildlife management can be accomplished by just doing these little things with forest harvest? Because forest management has such a big impact on all of these values, especially wildlife. How can we start to do more? Like, do those little things, those patches and the leaving standing dead, does that make a big difference, or is it more just us being like, well, maybe this will help and we'll see?
Yeah, well, that's where research fits in, because you've got to separate out it feels good from it is goods, and there's some good research that suggests that these residual patches in even aged larger harvested patches are stepping stones. But there's also data that shows that they aren't corridors. They don't allow amphibians, for example, to move through the landscape very well. They're not big enough. They're almost all edge, so they don't really provide any interior habitat. But I've seen some very strong evidence that, for example, they maintain diversity of non-vascular forest plants and some of the things that people might not think about, and fungi and mosses in microclimates, which then, as the surrounding stand grows back, can colonize the surrounding stand. On the other hand, that was a big trend in Maine for a while, and I think what people found is that they were leaving these residual patches, which is only so much residual because it takes away from your harvestable volume. So by putting a lot of residual patches, that then oftentimes here, would blow over. And, so not maintain those mature close canopy forest conditions. So they were no longer even affecting the non-vascular plants. They were wasted fiber, and it was fiber that could have been used to maybe set aside some sizable blocks of core habitat for forest birds or martins or something else outside of the forested or the harvested area. So, I think they're well intentioned. They can be effective, but I think you've got to know what you're trying to achieve with them and monitor and make sure that you're getting there. I think there's great literature suggesting leaf trees, snags, potential den sites, etc., can be useful. On the other hand, in some cases, those are perching spots and can create habitat sinks for some of the prey because they provide open visual habitat in places for raptors to forage from. So it depends what your objectives are and who you're trying to help. And I guess I would think that through, because it costs a significant amount of money to leave those leaf patches aside.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. And like you said, I think early on when we started doing this residual thing, they all blew over. Like basically you can go to all the like early couple-ox when they started doing that, and like, they pretty much all blew over. It wasn't well thought out. And then we learned from that. And now you start to see, a lot of them still do fall over, but now you start to see bigger patches. So you still get the edges fall over, but a large intact portion in the middle, or you start getting more selective with what patches you leave. You're not leaving, really, really tall, productive timber. You're leaving some of the maybe, you know what I mean? Stuff that will survive. But right. You're right. Like it's basically just down to, they can be good. Do your research, make sure you're doing it right, because otherwise it might just be a waste of time and money and not actually helping. So that's interesting. That's an interesting point.
And any money that's lost, or revenue that's lost by putting aside a couple with the objective of keeping some closed canopy, mature forest conditions in the middle as a stepping stone, even for non-vascular plants. If it blows over and becomes edge habitat, well, there's already all kinds of edge habitat around that cut. So that's all lost revenue that you could have been putting into biodiversity conservation someplace else and somehow else. Right.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying they're bad. I'm saying just I think sometimes we do things because they feel good rather than having direct evidence and an objective of what we're trying to help, and then monitoring whether in fact we're helping it.
Case in point, the whole situation in Maine and the public involvement.
Right.
Yeah, right. For sure. No, and that's kind of, I guess, what I'm getting at is trying to figure out how the forest industry, because we have such a big footprint, how can we be better and help out these other values? And in this case of this conversation, wildlife being the key one, right? So, obviously it's a complicated conversation. It's impossible to try and suss out exactly what should be done, because every area, every zone is going to be different. But it sounds like at the end of it all, you like the most important thing we can do is maintain big cover groups, right? Like it comes down to simply just maintaining the cover groups that we have and maintaining the age classes that we have, and just making sure that that's around, and that's going to get us almost all the way there. And then the specifics around individual species at risk have to be just sussed out, and we have to go at it one species at a time, I guess.
Yeah, but one thing we found is that there's commonalities among our species of risk. They're responding to,
there is. Okay.
To some of the same bottlenecks, right? And in our case, it might be decreased composition and extent and increased fragmentation of mature, mixed, and conifer dominated forests. And so now you can have a strategy that says, okay, so how are we going to get around that? And first we may need to change some of our objectives for some of these species, and our expectations, but we're not going to lose any of them, by hook or by crook. So, what do we need to do to maintain viable populations of these species? We're not going to be able to maintain natural populations, but let's think about viable populations. And I think, on a positive note, we have so many tools to do that now with remote sensing and LiDAR and, virtually a free time series of satellite data going back to the 1970s. We can look at how the forest has changed. We can quantify what we're losing, and where we've got distributional or configuration problems with certain habitats. And we can plan, between wildlifers and foresters. We can get together and say, okay, how do we need to plan future harvests to maintain or achieve a landscape objective 20 or 30 years out? And all those tools are there. Forest supply modeling has evolved. Forest landscape modeling has evolved. If we know what we want and can come to the agreement of what we want, we can plan to get there.
We can do it. Oh, totally. We have
tools. We've got the tools.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we got the desire too. It's just a matter of sorting out just narrowing down exactly what it is we want to do.
Right. And staying on a course that, recognizes forests take a while to grow, and we may not be able to get there for 20 or 30 years. Mm-hmm. I'll leave you with an example of a project that we went into with the Nature Conservancy. They bought 180,000 acres of northern Maine, and they wanted to manage it for forest revenue, and they sold it to their donors as an area they were going to manage for marten and lynx and get this umbrella species thing. But they bought cutover land. And they also bought it in an area where there was a wild free-flowing river that they wanted to conserve. So they had objectives along the river as well. And we did a modeling project for them based on landscape imagery and all of our models of marten and lynx, and showed them that in the short term they could meet their lynx objectives for early successional habitat, and they couldn't meet their marten objectives unless they took a 5 to 15 year hiatus of harvesting. And of course, folks weren't very happy about that because it affected revenue. But in the long run, with the objectives of that land, they're going to be able to harvest more wood if they wait, and they're going to get their marten habitat back. And in fact, they decided to meet their objectives, they were going to have to take some area permanently out of harvesting and put it in reserve. And it's not marten habitat now, but it will be marten habitat in the future, and it will stay as marten habitat going forward. So at the end of the day, they were able to meet all their objectives, and they had to make some compromises. And I think we could be doing the same kind of things on larger landscapes. And in fact, if they don't start off already at a fairly degraded condition, like a lot of the conifer or the crown forests and the national forests in the U.S. are going to be in, good condition going in. I think we've got a lot of opportunities to plan towards the future.
Awesome.
I mean,
that's great to hear.
To do it.
Yeah, well, we definitely got the tools and the desire. Yeah, that's awesome, man. I appreciate it. So it's fair to say then that forest management, the way we have it, the way it exists, it's an important tool that we need to utilize to, even when it comes to wildlife management, you think? Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what I figured, but you never know. You just want to hear it from somebody else, right? Absolutely. I mean, if we were in a pristine condition, we could leave it pristine, but we are not in a pristine condition anymore. And there are a lot of forest management practices that create wildlife habitat, and we have to take what we know about that, plus the world's demands for fiber and their desire for wildlife habitat. And we've got to figure out a way to put those together. And I think we can certainly do it. And I think there's certainly a shared will between foresters and wildlifers to work together to do it. Absolutely. Absolutely. One final thing before we go. This is just a pie in the sky question. So if you had a magic wand, you can make a change right now to, the work that you do or to the way we manage the landscape. What would you do? How would you change the way we do things? So you can use Maine as an example. I'd switch our planning from stand level, focused forest management to landscape management, and decide what our objectives are for landscapes rather than for individual stands. I think if we can pull that off, it'll be a lot easier to balance wildlife objectives, forest biodiversity, and forest sustainability. Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that. As long as I understand you correctly, I think the way we manage it in Alberta and BC and a lot of Canada is the landscape level, I think. But it seems like the way to go, right? That's the way the forest works, is on a landscape level. To do it on a stand level seems like you're setting yourself up for failure. That's for sure.
Right. And we set stand level objectives. We want regeneration of such and such a species at such and such of density, et cetera. But we're not near as good at setting landscape scale objectives.
I see. I understand what you're saying. That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That makes perfect sense. I mean, like you said, the forest is a slow growing thing, and you know what I mean? We need to be talking about like 200-year planning horizons here to do it effectively. So absolutely. Thanks, man. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to come on and do this. This was good. I wasn't sure where we were going to go, but I think this was a productive discussion. So thanks for taking the time. Thanks for listening, folks. Appreciate you checking out the whole thing. It means a lot. Remember to rate and review, share this with a friend. Tell people about it. That's how this thing gets around, is telling people about it and rating and reviewing on iTunes and that kind of stuff. And, share it on social media. I would appreciate it. And we'll see you guys next time. Next time, we have a continuation again of last week's episode. We have Milo Mihalovic back on. And that is an incredible conversation about forest regeneration. How do we get the forest that we want? And all the messy details around that. So it was really, really cool. You guys are going to love it. We'll see you in a couple weeks. Take it easy.